going to show you how to start using some double pointed needles. This is a set of double pointed needles right here. These are bamboo needles, and bamboo is really good for beginners when you start working with double pointed needles, because they're not very slippery, so your stitches catch a little bit better, which is really helpful when you first start learning how to do this. You can also use metal needles. These are actually the ones I prefer because they're a little bit sharper, and your stitches will slide a little bit easier. But I would hold off on these until you get a little bit better, because they are kind of tricky to work with at the beginning. So you can use, when you use double pointed needles, you can use either 4 or 5 of them at a time. Personally, I like to use 5 of them, because then you have an even square of 4 needles all the way around that you're working with, instead of a triangle. And I think it's just a little less hectic that way. And what I've done here is I've gone ahead and cast on all my stitches that we're going to use. I cast on 24 stitches, and you just cast all your stitches onto one needle. I just used a long tail cast on, which we have a video on if you don't already know how to do that. So you can learn how to do a cast on if you don't already know. And I did 24 stitches, so we're going to do 6 stitches on each needle. So after you cast on your stitches, then you want to start adding your needles. So we're going to start with our first needle. I always slip mine purlwise, so we're going to do 6 stitches on each needle. Okay, so that's our first needle. Always slide your stitches to the center so they don't fall off. Now we're going to add our second needle, or rather our third needle. And we're going to do 6 stitches on here. And then slide those stitches to the middle so they don't fall off. We'll add our fourth needle. Slide those to the middle, and slide these to the middle. So now you've got 6 stitches on all of these scary looking needles. I like to lay mine out so that I can really see what I'm doing. So this is how you're going to be knitting. You're going to be knitting in this little square, and you want to make sure, this is really, really important, you want to make sure that none of these are twisted, because if you get any of these twisted, and it's more likely to happen when you have more stitches than this, but if you get them twisted, you can't fix it. You have to tear everything out and start all over again. So I always like to lay mine out and make sure they all look nice and even, and there's no twists. Okay, so I'm going to turn them over, and you're going to start knitting where your yarn is. So this is going to become the last needle that you work with. Okay, and you're going to knit onto the next needle. And I know this all looks really wonky here because we've got so many needles, and it is sort of like wrestling with an octopus until you get better at doing it. So this is where you want to introduce your 5th needle. So you're going to start with your 5th needle into where you want to connect. And I always like to do my first stitch with both my tail yarn and my working yarn, like that. And you want to pull this really, really tight, because if you don't, you're going to have a gap in between these 2 stitches. So pull that really nice and tight, and then go on to your next stitch. Okay, so now you've joined your round, and I can drop my tail, and just continue working with my working yarn. I know this is hard to see with all this. And let me just tell you that when you start any project with double pointed needles, it looks like crap until you get like 6 or 8 rows into it. It just does. So don't get frustrated and give up until you've knit at least 6 or 8 rows. Okay, so that was our first needle. Okay, a good idea is to put a stitch marker here so that you know this is the beginning of your round. That way, if you need to change colors or if you need to count rows or anything like that, then you know that this is the beginning of your round. So after we finish that, we go naturally to the next needle in our repertoire here. And again, you want to pull this first stitch nice and tight, because otherwise you're going to have ladders in between your needles. So you can knit across this one. Okay, so that's that one. Try, if you can, to just ignore the fact that there are 5 needles here and just work on 2 needles at a time. So we're going to the next step in the process here, and again we're just working with these 2 needles. All these other ones are just kind of hanging out. So just working with these 2. Again with this first stitch, I like to insert my needle into my second stitch and then pull that next stitch really tight. That way you get a nice tight join there. And after you do about 6 rounds or so, it won't be quite so critical to pull those joins really, really tight like you need to on the first few rows. It'll sort of even out after a while. Okay, and at the end of every round or every needle, I just like to check all my needles and make sure I don't have anything falling off, because it is easy to have stitches fall off. Okay, so now we're on our 4th needle. Again, pull that first stitch nice and tight. And the reason that you use double pointed needles, this is a way to do circular knitting that's really small, like say for a sock or a baby sleeve or something like that, something where it's not really practical to use circular needles unless you're using magic loop knitting, which is a whole different story, and we have a video on that. So if you do want to use circular needles for small diameter knitting, you can do that, but you have to use a special method called magic loop. So that is our first round that we've completed. You can see nothing is twisted on either side, and we've got this nice collapsible rectangle, or square rather, to work with. So that's the first round, and then what you do is you just keep going around and around and around, and when you get to, like I said, 6 or 7 rounds, it's going to start looking a lot neater, and it's going to be a lot easier to manage. But the first few rounds, just know that they're going to be kind of squirrely and tough. One thing that you always want to remember with working in any kind of circular knitting is to always make sure you're going in the right direction, because it's really easy to turn this around and start knitting here and use this yarn. You always want to make sure that your yarn is on your left side, and that where you're knitting, your yarn is not attached, because then you're going to start getting your stitches all mixed up and it's going to look wrong. So make sure that you're working yarn, just like when you're doing regular flat knitting, it's always going to be in your left hand. But that's how you start working with double pointed needles.